Welcome back to another episode of Geek Out. Thanks for joining us. For this episode, we're going to be pulling it all together from the previous episode. The 5 fundamentals that we covered last week are rule of thirds, basics of framing, lighting, repetitive framing, and screen directions. With those in mind, let's dive in, no pun intended, to the trailer for Frozen 2, because it's actually really good. Whether you like Frozen or don't like Frozen, they execute the fundamentals really well. We're only looking at the first section of the trailer. It's less than a minute of footage. I think it's about 30 seconds. If you missed last week's episode, I highly suggest you get caught up before digging into this week's episode. So the links will be in the card and in the description below, because we're going to be talking about those 5 fundamentals in practice in one sequence. So without any further ado, here are why the first 30 seconds of the Frozen 2 trailer are an amazing study. So first off, let's start with setting the scene, right? This is the first thing that you're going to see when this trailer plays. Lighting. Let's start with lighting. This sequence already has its own tone with this dark, ominous kind of lighting that's happening here. So it's already setting a great emotional tone based on the values within this scene, right? Nothing is getting anywhere close to white. The lightest we have is Elsa and her hair, like the tips of the water will sometimes get kind of a light gray. The whitest whites that we have, right, versus the blackest is happening up here. It's creating contrast, right? It draws our attention to this contrast that's happening here. She isn't moving much. The water is what's moving, so of course that's going to draw our eye in. The other thing that we want to talk about, again, for a fundamental, is screen direction. Notice that she is facing towards the left, so she is going to be fighting against this current. As we said earlier, the tone and the emotion of this inner struggle for Elsa is being visually showcased with her screen direction, as she is struggling against the current. Alright, so we already have a good setup between the lighting and the screen direction. Let's start taking this apart. Alright, rule of thirds. We have Elsa standing within one of the thirds. Her face is on the point. Notice that a lot of the big water waves happen over here to balance that. Notice also how much darkness is happening here, which kind of counterbalances. Notice that the lightning hits right in the center of the frame. Notice that it dies off on the edges, so it brings your attention really to the middle of the frame. So, rule of thirds again, right? We talked a little bit about rule of thirds when you have only one subject, that we can put it right in the center of the frame. What does it do for this sequence? Well, it definitely allows Elsa to feel very lonely. She is surrounded by black. She's surrounded by darkness. Really works well to paint this idea of loneliness. Next, Elsa is running to the water. Notice the repetitive framing has been broken. The other sequences were very stable. She didn't move much. This is the first big movement that's happened. So because of that, notice that the camera is actually moving as she is moving. It builds the excitement. The first 2 shots are very flat as far as perspective goes. This is the first one where we get her running at a diagonal, right? We're kind of breaking up the stability from the previous shots with this moving camera plus her running diagonal. We do rule of thirds though. Notice that she lives within that middle third once again. Also notice that the water pretty much lives within the top third of the camera. Elsa's movement pattern draws a good diagonal through the center of the frame. Adds interest. There's a lot of different pieces that are happening here to add tension and interest to the flat composition that we previously had. So this camera, she jumps in and is running across the water, right? I think this is the first time we've seen her run across water. Didn't we see her run across ice in the first one? I don't know. I could be wrong. Notice repetitive framing again. Totally different camera. Closer in, and we also get the front of her. We get to see her face. Notice that she is still running towards the left side of the frame. Even though we've rotated around her, she still continues in the correct screen direction. Notice that Elsa pretty much stays again within the center of the frame. So the camera is tracking with her as she is running to keep her in her third of the frame. This is becoming more of a light source compared to this darkness. Notice her scale is drastically changed. She is very small compared to the previous frame where she was a lot closer to the camera. If we break this down again in the rule of thirds, she still resides within the center third of the camera. Also notice that she continues her movement from the correct direction The camera is moving quickly, right? We only get a short amount of time to see her in each of these shots. The shots move very fast. So because of that, they are using the light from her ability for us to be able to find her in this otherwise very dark space. Whether her ability making light really makes sense or not, it's working in a visual way for the audience to know where to look. Notice that we're getting these light sources again that are trailing behind her. Continuity between the frames. The important new fundamental that I want to introduce is scale. Notice how small Elsa is in the previous frame. We get a grander scale of how big and how vast this ocean is compared to her. And then they continue to build that sense of scale within the next frame. By pulling the camera down very low, we reconnect with the character, right? We're in her shoes in this moment. From our previous camera, correct, we saw the sense of scale of how vast this ocean is and how small she is. With repetitive framing in mind, right, they need to change up the camera again, but how can they change up the camera and continue our sense of scale as an audience member? How do they do that? Well, they bring the camera nice and low. We're closer to Elsa, and we get to see this massive wave coming up. Between the previous camera and this camera, we get a great sense of scale. This also allows us to reconnect with the character by feeling what she's feeling. I just want to take a moment to say how crazy that is. The fact that they know that they have to move the camera, but rather than just moving it willy-nilly, they're intentionally picking camera angles that really push the emotional feeling of Elsa. That's crazy to me. They're so intentional about the cameras that they use in order to build that emotional sequence. Right, so the next frame is her throwing her magic power out. Notice that, again, lighting, that her power is the primary source of lighting against this darkness. They have a great sense of contrast happening here, where we never lose Elsa, and we also get that emotional feeling of her loneliness. It's just her and this giant darkness. Her light is also highly saturated compared to the water behind her. This light that's being cast forward is balanced by the darkness behind her. Notice that if we were going to compare contrast, the brightest part of the screen is here, and the darkest part of the screen is here. This creates a good balance of the frame. This diagonal that happens draws us through her face. It's very easy for only one character for the scene to feel very off balance, but they've done a great job here at keeping everything balanced by using light and the posing of Elsa, as well as the framing of her pose within the camera, right? There's a lot of different pieces that are all at play here that all work simultaneously together and sing the same note. This hidden language, this hidden visual language of storytelling, that's what it is. It's all of these little tiny pieces all put together that you never would notice until you sit down and actually observe them. So continuing our sense of scale, the new fundamental that I've introduced to you, as well as continuing repetitive framing, how big she is versus this water. And then we also continue to reconnect with the character up close, so that way we never lose that emotional impact and that emotional journey that she's on. If this entire sequence only had one close-up at the very beginning where she ties her hair, and then everything else was just wide shots, it would be easy for us as the audience to disconnect with her. However, this repetitive framing as an opportunity to connect to the audience or set a sense of scale or ABCD, whatever it is, right? So use that rule not as a rule to hang yourself by. This is the first time Elsa has left the center of the frame. And why is that? So that way we can see that sense of scale, right? Look how tiny she is compared to this massive wave, compared to her massive powers, right? Her powers are ridiculous. She is almost in this bottom corner, but the magic goes all the way up to the top corner. So we still get that sense of balance. Also notice the lighting is working in our favor. This bright white, highly saturated blue is cutting this otherwise mostly monotone gray blue, right? If this was a sunny day out, this sequence would be very different. But because everything is dark compared to the light that's coming from her, it's very easy to see what's happening and it builds that sense of emotion. All right, we're gonna break this scene down twice because two different things are happening here. She still resides within the bottom right area of the frame. She was down here before and now she's over here. So the audience doesn't lose sight of her. She doesn't magically pop over here, frame her on the opposite side where the audience might lose her. We keep her in her same general area. She has returned to the center of the frame and we have this great framing of her ice wall. It frames around her. Notice the light is also at her feet. It also draws our eye to her. And along the top third of the frame, we have the water starting to crash over the ice, right? It's a great setup for what's about to come. We feel it, we see it, we're on board, we're keeping up. They haven't lost us yet with all of the action that's happening here. In a very grand scale, they haven't lost us yet. Through this sequence, we get to see the cracks that are happening with the ice versus the water. Notice the camera comes down farther, looking up to this massive wall. It makes us feel very small and insignificant, along with Elsa, who must feel the same way. They're building that sort of feeling because they are putting us in her shoes. We are down in the ditch with her. So then it shoots to a close-up of Elsa's face. So we got to see a wide shot setting the scale. Then we got to feel what she was feeling by running the camera right behind her, and then we shoot very close in on her face. Now we are back to an emotional investment with the character. We see this crashing ice and we're worried about her, and now she confirms that worry that we already feel with her facial expression. She is once again in the center of the frame. Notice her pink face compared to all of this gray, right? It's very easy for us to find her in her eyes, in her bright pink face, compared to all of the desaturated ice surrounding her. Angles are once again uneven, which is great. We have this diagonal that she's running. She continues to run the same direction, but notice that she doesn't fall straight back from the camera. She falls in an angle because, again, with the diagonal angle that we started talking about, diagonals increase our panic and our worry that we feel as the audience. So she is still in the center of the frame. However, her movement is diagonal. It's very easy when you put a character in the center of the frame for everything to feel very stale, but they have done a great job of using her diagonal run as adding interest to the scene and making a normally flat sequence feel very dynamic and deep because of the sense of perspective that's happening here. Being at an angle helps make this sequence feel a lot more unique, even though she is, for the most part, stale in the center of the frame. So, rule of thirds again, she's in the center of the frame. Notice that she falls slightly at an angle as well. She doesn't fall absolutely straight down. It's still got that diagonal curve that we keep feeling, where she's run this way, run up this way, and then fallen this way, right? It all feels like one consecutive curve. Sense of scale, one of our new fundamentals, is very obvious in this scene, right? We connected with her, we were up close, we saw her fall, and now we get to see the scale of that fall. The scale of those waves hitting her is the perfect nail in the coffin emotional beat for the struggle that they've set up for since the beginning. But a new term that I want to introduce to you guys is pacing. Notice the shots towards the end have a lot of movement happening. The camera moves quicker and quicker. The shots move quickly through the action. But early on, notice not a lot happened in each shot, right? It's just her tying her hair up, her watching the water, her starting to run, but by the end, everything happens in the blink of an eye. This pacing helps build excitement. It helps build that anticipation for the payoff that they set up for at the beginning. So pacing is how fast you have the character move through a sequence. You can build the anticipation for an action sequence like this by using pacing. How long is the shot? How much happens in the shot? All of that stuff. That's what pacing basically means. Really quick, I just fast forwarded a couple of frames. Notice how tiny her splash is compared to this giant mountain of water. It's a great sense of scale. As the audience, what can happen a lot is, unless you have a landmark, which by that I mean, if you're shooting in an area that has the Eiffel Tower and you're moving the camera around, we can sense a sense of scale and distance by that landmark of the Eiffel Tower, wherever that is in the scene. With this sequence, it's very hard because it's just this unending mass of water, right? There's no real landmark there, it's just water everywhere. Elsa has to be our landmark. So because of that, the storytellers have made it obvious what direction she is running in. She doesn't change direction. We have the icicles that trail behind her as she runs. We have the light source under her feet that helps us stay focused on where she is in the frame if she's very small. All of these things are being kept in mind to help aid the fact that we're just in a giant space that has no other landmarks. This would be a difficult sequence in order to deal with because it is just this big dark sky and this big dark ocean. They're using all of these rules to help aid them in a difficult sequence. So that's the first 30 seconds. If you were to break down this whole 30-second bit, it would be a girl has ice powers, runs across the water, tries to freeze the water, and it goes unsuccessful and she falls back. Like, that's it. That's the whole story right there. But the emotional appeal that they have built into this sequence, just makes me geek out about it, which is why I wanted to use it as footage for one of the segments. So hopefully you enjoyed learning much more about this sequence as well. Let's recap our fundamentals before we end out. Rule of thirds. When having only Elsa in the shot, you can use the center of the frame to invoke a feeling of loneliness and single out the audience's focus. Framing. On mostly empty scenes, they use the contrast of light and dark to balance the frame. Lighting, not only used for setting the proper emotional tone from the start, lighting can be used to draw the viewer's attention to the correct area of the frame. Repetitive framing, not only a rule to keep in mind, but use the need of changing the camera angles to better tell your story. Screen direction. Although they flip around Elsa relentlessly, using screen direction helps them keep this sequence feel grounded and it's easy to follow. New fundamental, scale. A sense of scale is used in this sequence to build tension and emotional investment in the audience. And the final new fundamental, pacing. When building up to something exciting or a large emotional payoff, such as Elsa attempting to conquer the ocean, they use quicker and quicker motions and shots to build the energy in the audience. Alright, so if you enjoyed seeing these fundamentals in action, comment below something you didn't notice before about this trailer until now. What took you by surprise? If you are new to Geek Out, don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. And I'll see you guys on the flip side.